Have you ever found yourself just caught in that swirl of mixed feelings? Wanting two totally opposite things at the same time, or just feeling really unsure where you actually stand. We often just call it ambivalence, but well, as we found digging into this, it's way more complex than simple indecision. So today we're doing a deep dive. We want to get into the psychological roots, the impact it has inside us, and maybe especially how it plays out in our relationships.
Yeah, and to help us unpack all of that, we've pulled together insights from quite a few places. We've got articles from Psychology Today. There's the big overview on Wikipedia, of course. We've also looked at attachment theory for beginners for some background, even, real stories people shared on Reddit about emotional intelligence. Quite a mix.
Right. So the plan is, as always, to kind of pull out the most important bits, the real nuggets of knowledge from all this. Hopefully, it helps you understand this really common but complex human thing a bit better, and maybe get some clarity, some strategies for dealing with it, whether it's, your own feelings or dealing with others. Okay, so let's start with the basics. What is ambivalence exactly? Because it's not just being unsure, it's definitely not indifference that's not caring. And it's not ambiguity, which is more about a situation being unclear. Ambivalence is fundamentally about having strong opposing feelings or thoughts about the same thing at the same time. Like wanting that amazing, super high calorie dessert, you love the taste, right? But you also really dislike the calorie count simultaneously. Or maybe you get a fantastic new job offer. You're thrilled, obviously, but maybe also kind of terrified. Happy and scared together. That tension, that's it.
Exactly. That's the core of it. And psychologically speaking, we can even break it down a bit further. Researchers talk about felt ambivalence. That's the feeling you recognize, the conscious conflict, the mixed emotions, the indecisiveness that feels uncomfortable. But then there's also something called potential ambivalence. This is more about just holding diverse attitudes, having different evaluations, even if you don't feel conflicted right at that moment. And what's really interesting is these two aren't always strongly linked. You can hold potentially conflicting views without constantly feeling torn apart by them.
Okay, so if you are feeling that conflict, that felt ambivalence, how does that actually affect things? Like day-to-day decisions? Well, it seems it really impacts our decision-making, makes it less efficient. We process information slower, take longer to respond, which, makes sense why it often leads to putting things off, procrastination, or just avoiding the decision altogether. And that psychological discomfort, especially when a choice has to be made soon.
And it's fascinating. They've actually found ways to sort of visualize this internal conflict. There's this method called the mouse tracking paradigm. Imagine you're on a computer, choosing between two options. If you're feeling ambivalent, when you move the mouse cursor to click your choice, it literally tends to curve just slightly towards the option you didn't choose before landing on your final answer.
Wow, really?
Yeah, it shows that pull, that internal debate happening in real time. And these conflicting evaluations, this pull, it's actually felt as, well, unpleasant, aversive. It increases our physiological arousal and basically motivates us to try and reduce that discomfort to somehow resolve the conflict.
Well, okay, so that's the internal experience. Well, what about when ambivalence shows up in our relationships with other people? This is where things get maybe a bit surprising.
Some of the material we looked at suggests that ambivalent relationships can actually be more taxing, more draining than relationships that are just clearly toxic.
Yeah, that really jumped out. There's this one study with police officers. It found that the officers who dealt with more ambivalent people in their work reported lower job satisfaction and actually took more sick days.
And you have to ask why that might be, right? Why are these ambivalent connections so insidious?
Well, I think with toxic relationships, the signs are often clearer. Maybe more obvious negative behaviors, perhaps even narcissistic traits. You can often see it, name it, and maybe get out.
Right, it's more overt.
Exactly. But ambivalent relationships, they're slipperier, harder to pinpoint. There isn't always some big, obvious wrongdoing. Instead, there's this constant low-level hum of doubt and uncertainty. It kind of activates a subtle fear response, makes you feel on edge. And they have this tendency to sort of creep in and stay in, which just wears you down over time. So what does this look like in practice? What kinds of behaviors are we talking about when someone is acting ambivalently towards you?
The sources listed quite a few patterns. It's not just one thing. It's the combination that creates this feeling of insecurity. Like, number one, inconsistency. That hot and cold behavior. They pull you close, then push you away, and that often goes hand in hand with being really noncommittal. Vague about plans, maybe they rarely reach out first. You're always left wondering where you stand.
That uncertainty is key.
Yeah. And then there are things that sort of undermine your confidence, like questioning your achievements. Someone described them as dream killers, always finding the negative angle.
Ouch.
Or using backhanded compliments. You know, those comments that sound like praise but have a little dig hidden inside, leaves you feeling confused, not complimented.
Right. It chips away at your self-worth. And there's often this feeling of things being transactional, isn't there? Totally, like keeping score,
Right.
making everything feel like a tally of who did what for whom. And their support is conditional. They're there for you, but only when it's convenient or benefits them somehow. Then there's the more subtle stuff. Passive aggression disguised as concern, like saying, oh, I just worry you're not really thinking this through, when they just disagree.
Right, that undermining concern.
Or becoming the master of didacticism, always lecturing, turning your attempt to vent into some kind of teachable moment you didn't ask for.
Oh, yeah.
And this weird private versus public support thing, maybe they're supportive when it's just the two of you, but act distant or critical in front of others.
It all adds up to feeling like you're constantly negotiating the relationship rather than just being in it. And, you know, this really connects powerfully back to attachment theory. A lot of this inconsistent behavior mirrors what we see in anxious ambivalent attachment. This often develops in childhood if caregivers were inconsistent, sometimes there, sometimes not, emotionally or physically.
So the child never knows what to expect.
Exactly. They feel unsafe, unsure if their needs will actually be met. And then as adults, this can manifest in different ways. Maybe a reluctance to get too close, fearing rejection, or constantly worrying that their partner doesn't really love them back. It can lead to patterns of frequent breakups, or just feeling like relationships are generally cold, distant. Sometimes people with this pattern might even kind of cling to their own children for that security they lacked.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and it's important to differentiate this from, say, avoidant attachment, where people tend to push intimacy away, or disorganized attachment, which is more complex. And while, sure, some behaviors might look a bit like narcissism on the surface, the underlying driver in interpersonal ambivalence is often more about insecurity, maybe envy, or just their own unresolved emotional conflicts, rather than that deep-seated entitlement you see in narcissism.
And the impact on the person on the receiving end, it's huge. Being in that kind of dynamic, it's just mentally damaging. You start questioning yourself constantly, lose your confidence, feel completely drained. It really makes you think about those friendships, maybe even family relationships, where you walk away feeling just off, exhausted, even if nothing overtly bad happened.
Yeah, it's incredibly erosive.
Yeah.
Soul-crushing, as you said earlier. So, okay, what do we do about it? How do we navigate this? Let's start with the internal stuff. When you're the one feeling ambivalent, feeling torn. One really interesting idea from the sources is this concept of growth before decision.
Growth before decision.
Yeah. Instead of just exhausting yourself trying to force a choice you're not ready for, the idea is to invest in your own personal growth, because whatever decision you eventually make, that growth comes with you. It might involve self-reflection, therapy, learning new things, building resilience.
So work on yourself, and the clarity might follow.
Kind of. Or at least you'll be stronger, regardless of the outcome. In relationships, this could mean really exploring your own feelings, your patterns, learning to trust your intuition more, and also taking responsibility for your own emotional regulation, understanding how your moods affect others. It's also helpful to recognize that ambivalence is like the defining feature of the contemplation stage in change models. You're weighing the pros and cons.
Right, that stage where you think about changing potentially forever.
Exactly. If you don't move through it, you could be contemplating for decades. But there's an empowering way to look at it too. Ambivalence isn't necessarily just being flaky. It can actually be a sign of seeing things in a balanced, nuanced way. Recognizing complexity reminds me of that F. Scott Fitzgerald quote. Something like, the test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function.
I like that. It reframes it.
It does.
Hmm.
And if you do want to move from just thinking to actually doing, ideas from things like Atomic Habits can be useful. Making the desired change obvious, attractive, easy, satisfying. And the undesired stuff, the opposite. Difficult, unattractive, unsatisfying.
Okay, that's helpful for internal ambivalence.
Yeah.
But what about dealing with those ambivalent people in our lives, the ones causing the drain? The advice that came through pretty consistently was, meet them where they are. Don't kill yourself trying to change them or get something from them they can't consistently give.
Right. Protect your energy.
Yeah, and actively seek out and invest in relationships with people who do clearly invest in you. Show up for you consistently, Practically, this might mean, minimizing contact with the highly ambivalent folks, maybe not sharing as much personal information with them, setting really clear boundaries about what you will and won't accept,
Absolutely. Boundary setting is crucial.
and just reminding yourself it is not your job to fix someone else's inconsistency or their passive aggression. Recognizing those patterns for what they are and protecting your own emotional health, that's real emotional intelligence right there.
And just briefly, for those dealing with deeper attachment issues, maybe from their own past or seeing it in their kids, the idea of reparenting came up. It's about consciously building security through having consistent positive role models, setting clear limits, maintaining routines, and crucially, being available to reconnect and repair things after conflict. It's about providing that secure base.
Okay, so wrapping this up, our deep dive today really highlights that ambivalence is, well, complicated. It's got multiple facets. That internal kind, the feeling torn, it can actually be a sign you're thinking deeply, that you see nuance. It can be part of growth. But when it plays out externally in relationships, it often creates this really subtle but incredibly draining dynamic. And that requires clarity and strong boundaries from our side.
Exactly. I think the key takeaway is learning to distinguish between those two experiences. Is this my internal process working through complexity, or am I caught in an external dynamic that's unhealthy for me? Recognizing the signs, whether in yourself or in how others treat you, that's really the first most critical step towards engaging in a healthier way and honestly protecting your own well-being.
So maybe something to think about after this. Given that ambivalence can be both a sign of deep thinking and a source of real relationship pain, how can you tell when your own internal ambivalence is serving your growth versus when it's maybe keeping you stuck? And how does understanding that difference maybe change how you approach the connections you choose to nurture, or perhaps the ones you need to create some distance from?